Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Even in a situation where the firefighters are trying to do their job, there may be a Karen who demands their manager to complain about the inconveniences she's being put to. Well, let's see what she gets in the end. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Entitled parents versus firefighters. Another bushfire, another community at risk. The plan is simple. Start a back burn along the back fences of the community to create a fire break and to contain the fire. The wind is blowing towards the community, so the back burn will be going against the wind. Good conditions. We start lighting up the bush. 90% of the residents put up with the smoke and either close windows and doors or come up and talk to us over the fence, asking if they can do anything. Now, I'll take this time to mention that we wear full-face respirators to protect our lungs from the smoke. We can barely talk out of them. And when you're next to a running pump, you can barely hear anything. So back to the story. We're walking along and pause at a house to monitor the burn. There's quite a fuel load, so we want to make sure it's burned. Don't notice anything until we see a resident trying to use our second hose line. What? A quick discussion ensues. This mother had come out to inform us that the smoke was affecting her kid. Okay, this happens. So what? She'd come out to demand that we put out the fire we were lighting, and when we ignored her, she then decided to do it herself. A quick apology. It's noisy, we didn't hear you. She's understanding, but still insists that we put out the fire or give her kid one of our masks. No, I'm not going to affect my health for your kid. Also, he hasn't done the course. We advise her to close her windows and doors, but we're going to burn to protect her house. This is where she demands to see our commander, who at this point in time is hiding in the cab. He gets out, walks up to her, and issues an on-the-spot fine for obstructing of an emergency service. Let's just say for a while after that incident, the bush behind her property was burnt quite regularly. After all, we have to reduce the hazard to the community. And our second story. HOA unfairly fines my aunt for not shoveling her sidewalk. Since it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere, we're getting our fair share of snow, I have a story from my aunt. My aunt lives in a gated community in the Pacific Northwest. She's at a higher altitude, so she gets a bit of snow. She's a nice lady, very active, and always helps other people. Her HOA is a drinking club, as she describes them, have a whole bunch of rules, some totally ridiculous, heavily enforced and always changing. Usually when rules are changed, they get posted on some online community bulletin board from the days of dial-up. Also, they like to fine and shame people. My aunt never attended meetings because she has no time for drinking and cigarettes. As per usual, with a lot of bylaws, you have to clear the sidewalk in front of your house of snow and ice. My aunt, being the woman she is and living in a 55-plus community, she always shovels her walk and salts it for ice. A couple years ago, there was a heavier than usual snowfall, maybe over 20 inches in the higher elevations, with some warm days, then freezing temperatures for a few days after. So first snowfall, she gets up early and shovels her sidewalk and her walk and sprinkles down some salt. It snows a few inches more, so later in the afternoon she shovels the walk again and decides to salt again. She literally said she tossed a few handfuls of salt, and the neighbor across the street comes running up, demanding she stop salting, and it's a violation of the HOA rule. Whatever crap. It seems that a no salt rule was added to their book of great HOA rules, reasoning that salt crystals are unsightly, and posted on the unusable online bulletin board from 1999. Which at this point, the online bulletin board had been replaced by an under-maintenance error page for the past few months. There was no way the drunken HOA rule changes could be relayed to the commoners. Well, my aunt apologizes, gets a warning for the first time she salted, and a second for the handful of salt she applied in the second salting, then gets another warning for not properly clearing the sidewalk. Well, my aunt left maybe a strip of about 2 to 3 inches for about 2 feet on the edge of her sidewalk, which wasn't properly cleared of snow. Not a big deal, she made an excellent effort, but the HOA neighbor didn't think so. Next violation would be a fine. Also, she had to clean up all the rock salt with a broom. My aunt ended up getting the new HOA rules in writing from the HOA neighbor, which she read over and realized they only stated salt in the sidewalk snow shoveling rule, but nothing that blue salt-free ice melt. Also was stated is that the sidewalk should stay free of ice at all times. She also read a bit deeper to learn that street and sidewalk cleaning is covered by the HOA twice a year or as needed. Instead of risking HOA wrath of fines and some public shaming because now it's near impossible to prevent the sidewalk from freezing up, she decides she'll challenge the vodka-induced reasoning of the HOA and will use the blue non-salt ice melt to keep her sidewalk ice-free. The next day, after an overnight snowfall, she heads to the local hardware store to buy some blue non-salt ice melt, strikes up a conversation with the shop owner about her issue, who recommends these blue ice melting pellets, and throws in a bag of clay kitty litter on the house so she can stick it to them idiots. That afternoon, the temp rises just above freezing, and there's a heavy, wet snowfall of a few inches, which hits the ground, wet, melts, and refreezes when temperatures go below freezing at nighttime. So instead of risking having a skating rink for a sidewalk, she clears the wet snow, then dumps a bunch of these blue ice melting pellets and a whole bunch of kitty litter. Overnight it freezes. Next day she has the most ice-free sidewalk in all of the neighborhood, and it's covered in ice melt pellets. Well, it rains that day. Her use of kitty litter and blue ice melt pellets don't go unnoticed by HOA neighbor. That afternoon, she's fined by the HOA officer in charge of fines for breaking rule #vodka section stale cigarette smoke. She sees nothing wrong. The road is salted and sanded and looks like a mess, so her sidewalk doesn't look too bad, all blue and gray speckled and ice-free. Then gets a notice to clean up the salt, which she ignores because it's not salt she's using to de-ice her sidewalk, but blue salt-free ice melt pellets and clay kitty litter. Then that day it rained, then froze, and continued to rain, then snow, causing everything to be covered in ice and snow the next morning. It was a disaster. My aunt cleared the snow from her sidewalk and applied more blue pellets and kitty litter, which wasn't a task because luckily she already had applied so much that there was already no ice on her sidewalk or snow. Everyone else in the neighborhood had to chip the underlayer of ice after they risked a horrific fall while clearing the top layer of snow. She then was fined again, while neighbors had to actually walk in the measly street in some parts because sidewalks in some spots were unwalkable. Warnings and fines were given to other unsuspecting neighbors who couldn't attend the HOA booze meetings and had mistakenly used salt or had not chipped and cleared all the sidewalk ice in an acceptable amount of time. The next few days were blue skies and below freezing with ice everywhere. Sidewalks had been chipped, but ice up over time with a thin layer of slick ice called black ice. People were falling, and my aunt now had a couple of rogue neighbors using all types of non-salt ice melt. One guy made a solution of brine and molasses, which he sprayed on and got great results. Others used sand, brine, non-salt ice melters, and even 15 gallons of wine, which turned to vinegar, was applied. The HOA's alcohol consumption probably increased as the officer fell on a patch of black ice out in front of his home, breaking his elbow while returning from delivering fines, warnings, and general nastiness. Eventually, the weather returned to above freezing levels and rain, which washed away all the various ice-melting substances. The rogue neighbors gathered at my aunt's house to enjoy tea and snacks. Amongst them was the man who used brine and molasses, who happened to have a license to practice law and was retiring with nothing else better to do than ruin the drunk, useless HOA at the next meeting. He then invited himself to the next meeting with the file folder of all the fines and warnings with a statement of dispute for each one. Also brought his tablet to prove the online bulletin board wasn't working, which helped the case that the HOA wasn't providing proper means of communication to the residents, which meant the residents could sign a petition to fire the standing HOA members and appoint an interim HOA till the election. My aunt was appointed treasurer, found the previous regime spent HOA funds at the liquor store. The retired lawyer president, who then went after the previous HOA for funds spent on booze, and they lived happily ever after. And our last story. Won't compensate me for my fence? then compensate me 100 times as much for my crops. This story is not mine, it's my brother-in-law's. My brother-in-law grows avocados in California. Several years ago, a portion of his ranch was ravaged by a wildfire. Or so he thought at first. When the smoke cleared, it became obvious that the fire was caused by an electrical line that was blown over by strong winds that had landed on his fence, catching it on fire. Since he'd been planning on diversifying his crops anyway, he decided he'd simply replace his fence, replant, and move on. To that end, he called up the electric company that owned the down line and asked them for about $10,000 in compensation to replace the fence that had been destroyed by their electrical line. They denied any and all culpability in the matter and told him that he should sue them if he didn't like it. What the electric company didn't realize was that my sister, his wife, works full-time as a corporate attorney for one of the largest utilities in California, defending against cases just like this one. At first, she was concerned that this utility was a subsidiary of her employer, in which case there would be a massive conflict of interest. Apparently, legal departments frown on their employees when their husband is suing them. Go figure. Thankfully, after some investigation, she realized that the utility in question was completely independent of her employer, and at that point, the gloves were off. My sister didn't represent her husband because she's typically on the other side of these cases, but she did advise him on everything he needed to bring to court to win his case, and she helped him find a very reputable lawyer with a solid record of winning cases like these. Not knowing what they were up against, the utility persisted in refusing to negotiate, hoping that by forcing my brother-in-law to trial, he would simply give up and go away. Spurred on by my sister's insistence that he had a solid case, he called their bluff and went to trial. As it turns out, California takes agricultural damage very seriously, and the court conducted its own independent investigation. It estimated the total damages at around $335,000, which is over 33 times as much as my brother-in-law had asked for initially. Furthermore, there's a law in California that awards triple damages in cases where agriculture is impacted, so the utility that had been unwilling to negotiate over $10,000 was now on the hook for over $1 million in damages. When all was said and done, my brother-in-law confided to me that he would have gladly settled for the $10,000 in arbitration, and that it would probably have taken him over a decade to even sell $1 million worth of crops. The utility had to have their day in court, though. Maybe that utility company will learn from their grave mistake and not treat others like this. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.